Tom huddled under the thin, dirty blanket, trying to ward off the cold that cut through the Chicago morning. The wind whistled through the streets, raising small spirals of dust and crumpled papers, while the gray sky promised another miserable day. In front of him, the worn sign said all he could offer to the world: just need $1. His stomach growled, the emptiness echoing louder than the hurried footsteps of people passing by without looking at him. The polished shoes, leather boots, and colorful sneakers passed by hurriedly, never slowing down. Only a young mother pulling a child by the arm cast a fleeting glance, as if contemplating helping him, but quickly looked away, adjusting her purse on her shoulder and quickening her pace. "Give up, Tom. Nobody's going to give you anything today," mumbled Martha, sitting a few meters from him. Her face was hollow, the tired and disillusioned look of someone who had seen many days like this one. She shivered under the weight of her patched coat, but seemed more worried about him than herself. Tom just shook his head. He had no words to respond. It wasn't the first time he'd heard that, and it probably wouldn't be the last. As he wiggled his fingers to keep them warm, a police officer appeared at the end of the street, his figure a threatening shadow. Tom knew what this meant. Just the day before, the same officer had warned him about vagrancy and made it clear that he wouldn't tolerate disturbances in the commercial area. With a heavy sigh, he lifted the sign higher, trying to attract some attention before it was too late. But instead of coins or bills, all he received were looks of disapproval. He felt the weight of hopelessness growing, a mountain he had no strength to climb. That's when Mr. Carter appeared. Tom noticed the luxury shopping bags first, carefully carried, swaying slightly against the well-cut suit. Then, he noticed the gleam of the gold watch on his wrist and the way he walked with a confidence that seemed to part the crowd. Coming out of an expensive boutique, Carter seemed completely oblivious to the harsh reality around him. But Tom felt something strange about that figure. He was tired of ignored requests, of disdainful murmurs, of being invisible. In an impulse he couldn't explain, his voice echoed, clear and unexpected. "Can you give me $1 or $1 million?" Carter stopped. The sudden movement made Tom hold his breath. The man turned his head slowly, eyes evaluating him from behind discreet but expensive glasses. Tom felt his blood freeze as he noticed the slightly arched eyebrow, as if he were evaluating a product on a shelf. "$1 million?" Carter repeated, almost as if savoring the word. The tone wasn't mockery, but curiosity. Tom nodded, not knowing what to say. He expected laughter or even direct disdain, but that serious look left him disarmed. Before he could respond, the tense atmosphere was broken. A group of young men approached, laughing loudly and pointing at him. Tom knew the type. He'd dealt with them before. They weren't just mockers, they were predators. "Hey, look at the beggar asking for millions," one of them taunted, while the others laughed. One of them lightly kicked Tom's sign, knocking it from his hands. Another bent down to pick it up, examining it as if it were a trophy. "Leave that," Tom shouted, his voice tearing through the cold air. He instinctively lunged forward, trying to recover the sign. The movement was met with a push that threw him back against the wall. The impact knocked the wind out of him. However, Tom didn't give up. He saw when the amulet fell from his pocket, a small round medallion, dirty but precious. It was the only thing left from his childhood, the last piece of his old life. Without thinking, he dove to the ground to rescue it, but one of the young men kicked it away. Adrenaline took over Tom. He fought with the energy of someone who had nothing left to lose, protecting the medallion as if it were life itself. His clenched fists, though weak and hurt, found the bodies of the young men, and he managed to grab his only possession before they ran away, laughing. With heavy breathing and hands throbbing with pain, Tom stayed there on the ground, holding the medallion against his chest. His vision was blurry, but not enough to ignore the pair of expensive shoes that stopped right in front of him. He raised his gaze, meeting Mr. Carter's penetrating eyes again. "Why do you want that $1 or $1 million?" asked the man, his voice calm but firm, as if he were about to make an important business deal. Tom blinked, trying to process the words. He didn't know if it was from hunger, pain, or fear, but he felt a wave of emotion taking over him. The question disconcerted him, but also made him feel something he hadn't experienced in a long time. Hope. With his heart racing, he answered sincerely, not knowing what to expect from this stranger so different from everything he had ever known. Tom raises his gaze and stares at Carter, his heart racing, not knowing what to expect from this sudden curiosity from the rich man. Tom wiped the dried blood from the corner of his mouth with the back of his hand, trying to appear firmer than he really was. He could still feel the impact of the kick and the weight of the fight he had just faced. But now, facing Carter, the pain seemed insignificant. The millionaire remained standing, his eyes fixed on Tom, as if trying to decipher him. The question still hung in the air, loaded with curiosity. "Why do you want that $1 or $1 million?" Because I'm tired," Tom replied, his voice hoarse and hesitant. "Tired of living like this. Every day, just trying to survive. No hope. Nothing." Carter didn't say anything. He just tilted his head as if considering those words. Tom felt the weight of the silence, but continued, feeling he needed to say more. "It's not just for me," he added, holding the medallion tightly in his dirty hand. "It's because I want to have a chance, you know? Just one chance to get out of this, to do something different. If I had $1 million, I wouldn't be here asking for coins." Carter's face remained impassive, but there was something in his eyes, a spark of interest perhaps, or something deeper that Tom couldn't identify. Marta, sitting a little behind, shook her head in disbelief. "This isn't going to work, Tom," she murmured, her voice low enough for only him to hear. "You think he's going to care? These types don't help. They just look and move on." Tom felt his throat tighten. Maybe Marta was right. Maybe he was betting too high by trying to touch a man like Carter, but he was already there, exposed and vulnerable. There was no turning back. Carter finally broke the silence. "Everyone has a story," he said calmly. "What's yours, Tom?" Tom blinked, surprised. He didn't know how to respond. Tell his story? The story of how he lost everything, of how life crumbled into 1,000,000 pieces and left him there, on the sidewalk. There was something about that man that made him hesitate, something that made him want to trust, but also fear, judgment. Before he could answer, Carter raised one hand, as if signaling he wasn't expecting an immediate response. He looked around, observing the street movement, before adjusting the watch on his wrist and taking a step back. "I'll be back tomorrow," he said without emotion. "Maybe we'll continue this conversation." And with that, he was gone, leaving Tom with more questions than answers. The next morning, the cold seemed even sharper. Tom felt his empty stomach, but the anxiety squeezed more than hunger. He sat in the same place, watching people move, hoping Carter would return. But the hours passed and he didn't appear. "What did you expect?" Marta asked, sitting on her own pile of torn blankets. "He's rich. Rich people don't come back. They say things to feel good and then disappear." Tom didn't answer. He wanted to believe Carter was different, but each minute that passed without a sign from him made that harder. He was about to give up when he noticed a figure approaching. It wasn't Carter, but a man wearing a city uniform. "What are you doing here?" the man asked with a harsh voice. "You know you can't stay in this place. You're blocking the way." "I'm waiting for someone," Tom said, trying to sound firm, but his voice came out more like a whisper. "I don't care who you're waiting for," the man retorted. "This is a commercial area. Either you leave on your own or I bring backup." Tom felt his blood boil. He had heard this before, so many times, and it always ended the same way. But now, something inside him didn't want to yield. He had to resist somehow. "I'm not leaving," he said, crossing his arms. "Not until he comes back." The inspector raised his eyebrows, clearly irritated by the response. He stepped forward, as if about to grab Tom, but suddenly stopped. In the distance, firm steps echoed on the asphalt. Tom looked over his shoulder and felt a wave of relief when he saw Carter approaching, accompanied by a man in a suit and tie. "What's going on here?" Carter asked, his voice calm but loaded with authority. He looked at the inspector, who seemed disconcerted by the millionaire's sudden presence. "This man is obstructing the area," the inspector said, with a defensive tone. "He needs to leave." "Is that so?" Carter asked, taking his phone from his pocket and pointing the camera at the inspector. "Because I see someone sitting, causing no problems. And I see you, bothering him without reason." The inspector hesitated, seeming not to know what to say. Carter stepped forward, keeping his gaze fixed on the man. "You know what happens when someone tries to violate another person's basic rights, don't you? Especially when there are witnesses." The lawyer beside Carter crossed his arms, a discreet smile on his face. "We can take this further, if you prefer," he said. The inspector looked from Carter to Tom and then to Marta, who watched the scene with wide eyes. Finally, he took a step back. "I was just following orders," he muttered, before turning and walking away. Tom let out a sigh of relief. He looked at Carter, still trying to process what had just happened. "Why did you do that?" he asked, his voice low. Carter looked at him, and for a moment it seemed like he was going to answer, but instead he gave a slight smile and said, "Let's talk more. I have a proposal." Tom walked alongside Carter through the busy streets of Chicago, feeling furtive glances from people around. He held the medallion in his pocket as if it were his anchor. The silence between them seemed endless, filled only by the sound of footsteps and the noise of cars on the street. When they finally stopped in front of a modest cafe, Carter opened the door with a brief gesture, indicating Tom to enter first. Inside, the smell of fresh coffee mixed with the muffled sound of conversations. Carter headed to a table in the corner, away from the windows, and sat down unhurriedly. Tom hesitated, looking at the environment before taking the chair across from him. It seemed surreal to be there, so far from the cold concrete where he used to sit. A waitress appeared quickly, the professional smile on her face. "The usual, Mr. Carter?" she asked, clearly familiar with the customer. He nodded. "Black coffee, and for you?" she asked, looking at Tom. Tom looked at the menu, but his mind was chaos. "Water," he answered softly. Carter thanked the waitress and turned his attention to Tom. "So, Tom," he began, interlacing his fingers on the table, "you asked me for $1 or $1 million. I don't do that kind of charity. What I do is invest." "Invest?" Tom repeated, confused. He didn't know what to expect, but those words caught him by surprise. "Yes," Carter continued without beating around the bush. "Invest in people who have potential. But potential doesn't come free. It requires effort, discipline, and a bit of courage." Tom remained silent, trying to absorb those words. He was used to hearing no, to being ignored or ridiculed. But now there was someone there who not only saw him, but was willing to say something beyond that. "What I'm offering," said Carter, leaning slightly forward, "is an entry-level job at one of my warehouses. Nothing glamorous. Hard work, little pay, but honest. And more. I'll arrange a place for you to live. Simple, functional, but away from the streets." Tom felt his heart race. A job, a roof. It was more than he could have imagined. But at the same time, it seemed far from the million he dared to ask for. "Why me?" he asked with a hesitant voice. "There are so many people out there. Why not ignore me like everyone else does?" Carter shrugged, an almost imperceptible smile on his lips. "Let's say you intrigued me. But don't mistake this for generosity. This is a test, Tom. What you do with this opportunity depends on you." Tom stayed quiet. He felt a lump in his throat, a mixture of gratitude and distrust. "I accept," he finally said, his voice almost failing. "I'll try." Carter nodded, satisfied. He pulled a card from the inner pocket of his suit and placed it on the table. "Here's the address of the warehouse and the apartment. Show up tomorrow morning. The keys will be waiting for you at the building." Tom took the card with trembling fingers, as if it were something precious. He didn't know what to say, but his mind was buzzing with possibilities. For the first time in years, he felt there was a chance, however small, to change his life. Outside the cafe, the cutting wind hit him immediately. Tom pulled his coat against his body and looked around. The city seemed different, more alive, as if it had gained new meaning. He spotted Marta in the distance, her small figure motionless like a shadow. "Marta!" he called, walking to her. The smile on his face disappeared when he saw her expression. She looked at him with a mixture of anger and hurt. "Are you really going to do this?" she asked, her voice loaded with disbelief. "Accept whatever he's offering and leave me here?" Tom stopped, shocked. He never thought she would see it that way. I'm not leaving you," he tried to explain. It's a chance, Marta. A chance to get out of here. If I get something, I can help you later." She laughed, but the sound was full of bitterness. "Help? You think it's that easy? That he'll give you something without charging dearly later?" "Marta, it's not like that." He reached out to touch her, but she backed away, her eyes full of pain. "I always knew you were naive, Tom. Good luck with your millionaire," she said, before turning her back and disappearing into the crowd. Tom stayed there, alone, holding the card in his pocket. He wanted to run after her, tell her everything would be fine, but the words simply wouldn't come. He knew she was hurt, and maybe she was right to be suspicious. Still, he couldn't ignore what he felt, a hope he hadn't experienced in a long time. The building was old, with peeling paint and dusty windows. Tom looked at the key in his hand, feeling a mix of nervousness and anxiety. He turned the lock, and the door opened with a creak. The apartment was small but clean. A mattress against one of the walls, a table and chair in the center, and an empty closet in the corner. There was a window overlooking an alley, where the distant sound of voices and footsteps filled the space. Tom entered slowly, touching the furniture as if it were unreal. He sat on the edge of the mattress, took the medallion from his pocket, and held it in his palm. For a moment he felt like a child again, when the world seemed full of promises and possibilities. He looked at the window, at the night sky that was beginning to fill with stars. For the first time in years, he felt he had something to fight for. It wouldn't be easy, he knew that, but for the first time, he had a starting point. As he lay down, exhausted but full of a new kind of energy, Tom closed his eyes, murmuring to himself, "Tomorrow, everything starts again." Tom closes his eyes, knowing that early tomorrow begins his first day at the warehouse, a new challenge that could change everything. The alarm clock in the corner of the room went off at 6 a.m, the shrill sound filling the silence of the small apartment. Tom opened his eyes slowly, feeling his body still heavy with fatigue, but also with a trace of anticipation. He got up and put on the simple, clean clothes that Carter had provided along with the apartment. The white t-shirt and jeans were a bit loose, but he felt different, almost as if he were wearing armor to face the day. As he walked to the warehouse, the morning cold enveloped him, but he barely noticed. His focus was entirely on what awaited him. Upon arrival, he saw the large industrial building, with forklifts zigzagging between parked trucks and workers already in motion. For a moment, Tom felt the weight of the place, as if he were too small to be there. A burly man with a hard expression and crossed arms stared at him as soon as he entered. He seemed to be waiting for Tom. He wore a worn flannel shirt and a cap that hid part of his face. "You're the boss's protege, aren't you?" said the man, his voice loaded with skepticism. Tom hesitated but responded, "I just want to work, sir. I'm not here for privileges." The man let out a short, dry laugh. "Is that so? We'll see how long you last." He introduced himself as Morris, the sector chief. "I don't expect much from you. Just do what I tell you." Tom nodded, keeping his head down. He was directed to the most basic tasks, carrying boxes, organizing shelves, cleaning the floor. The work was heavy, and his back started hurting even before noon. But he didn't complain. Each box lifted, each corner swept, was a step towards something bigger, he told himself. During lunch, he sat alone in a corner of the cafeteria, eating the dry sandwich he had brought. The other workers whispered and glanced in his direction. He knew what they thought. To them, he was just another lucky one placed there out of pity. He pretended not to hear and focused on the constant rhythm of chewing. One of the employees, a middle-aged man named Gary, approached and sat next to him. It wasn't exactly a friendly gesture, but it wasn't hostile either. "Don't mind what they say," said Gary. "Here everyone judges, but in the end it's the work that counts." Tom nodded, grateful for the words, even if brief. There was no more conversation, but that small moment helped him move forward. At the end of the shift, Tom felt every muscle in his body aching. His hands, unaccustomed to constant physical work, were red and swollen. As he walked back to the apartment, with the sky darkening, his mind filled with doubts. Was he up to this? Could he really leave the streets and build something? When he arrived at the building, he found Marta waiting outside. Her posture was rigid, and the look she gave him was full of resentment. "So, is this it?" she asked bluntly. "Now you're one of them? A respectable worker?" "Marta," Tom began, but she interrupted him, her arms crossed defensively. "You think this will save you, Tom? That just because you have a place to sleep and a job, things will change? You're just like me. We'll always be invisible." He felt a tightness in his chest. "I haven't forgotten about you," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "If I prosper, if I achieve something, I can help you too." "Saving others," she said with a bitter smile. "That's the biggest lie I've ever heard. Nobody saves anybody, Tom. Not in our situation." "I'm not trying to save you," he responded, with a mixture of frustration and sadness. I just want to try. If I don't do anything, I don't have any chance." For a moment, Marta seemed to hesitate, as if there was a part of her that wanted to believe him. But then she took a step back, shaking her head. "Good luck with that," she said, before turning and disappearing into the darkness of the street. Tom stood there, key in hand, feeling the weight of the entire day and now the weight of his choices. He went up to the apartment in silence, sat on the bed, and took the medallion from his pocket. He ran his fingers over the worn surface, as he always did when he needed strength. Through the window, he could see the distant city lights and hear the constant sound of sirens. It was a reminder of the world he was trying to escape from, but also an impetus to continue. As he turned off the lights in the room, he felt a new determination growing inside him. He needed to prove to Carter, to Marta, and most importantly, to himself, that he could do this. Tom closes the window, hearing distant sirens, wishing to prove that he's not just a lucky homeless person, but someone capable of forging his own path. The alarm went off, and Tom woke from a light sleep, his muscles still heavy from the previous day's journey. He got up quickly, determined to start early and not give anyone reason to doubt his dedication. While putting on the clean clothes he had prepared the night before, he mentally rehearsed the tasks he knew awaited him at the warehouse. Today would be different, he thought. Today he would show he was up to the opportunity. The walk to the warehouse was accompanied by Chicago's constant cold and the distant murmur of traffic. When he arrived, the place was already active. Forklifts zigzagged between narrow aisles, boxes were quickly unloaded, and the sound of voices merged with that of engines and tools. Tom took a deep breath and entered, trying to go unnoticed. However, Morris's gaze found him immediately. The boss was leaning against a stack of boxes, arms crossed and wearing a harsh expression. Tom knew any slip would be used against him. He waved slightly, trying to maintain a confident posture, but the man merely narrowed his eyes and turned to supervise another task. Tom dove into work. He organized boxes, transported heavy materials, and maintained the pace, even with the growing pain in his back. While moving a batch of stock to storage, something caught his attention. There was a pile of invoices left messily on a shelf. He quickly noticed that the numbers didn't add up. Some values seemed out of place, as if someone had made a gross error. For a moment he hesitated. Would it be better to ignore it? He remembered Gary's words, the only colleague who had shown some sympathy. Here, everyone judges, but in the end, it's the work that counts. He decided to note the discrepancies in a notepad he had found in the office and returned to work. Throughout the day, rumors began circulating among the workers. They said the Retailers Association was pressuring Carter for allowing someone like Tom to work there. The words were spoken in whispers, but they reached his ears, making the weight of the environment seem even greater. The distrustful looks became even more frequent, and he felt the tension was about to explode. And then, it did explode. Two men in suits appeared at the warehouse in the middle of the afternoon. Their expressions were serious, their well-cut suits contrasting with the industrial environment. They looked for Morris, who led them directly to Tom. "You're Tom, right?" asked one of the men, his voice firm and straightforward. "Yes," he answered, trying to stay calm. "We need you to leave," the other man said. "Now." Tom frowned. "Leave? Why?" "I'm just working." "You're disturbing the order," replied the first one, crossing his arms. "Your presence here is no longer acceptable." Tom's blood boiled. He had worked hard without complaining, trying to stay strong despite everything. Now they wanted to remove him without reason? He straightened his posture and faced the men. "I haven't done anything wrong. I have a job here, and I'm going to continue doing it." The men didn't like the response. One of them grabbed Tom's arm, trying to force him to move. The resistance was immediate. "Let me go," he shouted, pushing the man backward. The impact was enough to make him stumble into a pile of boxes, knocking some of them to the floor. The other workers stopped what they were doing, watching closely, but no one intervened. Morris just observed from a distance, showing no signs of helping. When the situation seemed about to spiral out of control, the warehouse door opened. Carter entered, accompanied by his lawyer, who wore a rigid and professional expression. "What's going on here?" asked Carter, his voice resonating through the space. The suited men backed away, clearly uncomfortable with Carter's presence. One of them tried to justify himself. "Mr. Carter, we're just ensuring your operation isn't harmed." "Harmed?" Carter interrupted, looking directly at them. "By someone who's working honestly? Who gave you this authority?" The lawyer stepped forward, adjusting his glasses. "If there's one more attempt to remove any employee without just cause, we'll take the case forward. Understood?" The two men exchanged nervous looks before muttering something inaudible and quickly leaving the warehouse. Carter looked at Tom, who was still catching his breath. He didn't seem angry, but his expression was serious. "Tom," he said, approaching, "I gave you a chance because I saw something in you. But the truth is, it won't be easy. You're being watched from all sides, and you'll need to prove you deserve to be here." Tom nodded, the weight of the millionaire's words falling on him. He knew the path would be difficult, but he was willing to face it. When the shift ended, Tom left the warehouse with tired shoulders, but renewed determination. He felt there was much at stake, more than he had imagined at the beginning. Before leaving, he looked back and saw Carter standing at the door, his gaze fixed on him. "I gave you a chance," Carter said, "but now you need to live up to it, or this all falls apart." The alarm went off, and Tom woke from a light sleep, his muscles still heavy from the previous day's journey. He got up quickly, determined to start early and not give anyone reason to doubt his dedication. While putting on the clean clothes he had prepared the night before, he mentally rehearsed the tasks he knew awaited him at the warehouse. Today would be different, he thought. Today he would show he was up to the opportunity. The walk to the warehouse was accompanied by Chicago's constant cold and the distant murmur of traffic. When he arrived, the place was already active. Forklifts zigzagged between narrow aisles, boxes were quickly unloaded, and the sound of voices merged with that of engines and tools. Tom took a deep breath and entered, trying to go unnoticed. However, Morris's gaze found him immediately. The boss was leaning against a stack of boxes, arms crossed and wearing a harsh expression. Tom knew any slip would be used against him. He waved slightly, trying to maintain a confident posture, but the man merely narrowed his eyes and turned to supervise another task. Tom dove into work. He organized boxes, transported heavy materials, and maintained the pace, even with the growing pain in his back. While moving a batch of stock to storage, something caught his attention. There was a pile of invoices left messily on a shelf. He quickly noticed that the numbers didn't add up. Some values seemed out of place, as if someone had made a gross error. For a moment he hesitated. Would it be better to ignore it? He remembered Gary's words, the only colleague who had shown some sympathy. Here, everyone judges, but in the end, it's the work that counts. He decided to note the discrepancies in a notepad he had found in the office and returned to work. Throughout the day, rumors began circulating among the workers. They said the Retailers Association was pressuring Carter for allowing someone like Tom to work there. The words were spoken in whispers, but they reached his ears, making the weight of the environment seem even greater. The distrustful looks became even more frequent, and he felt the tension was about to explode. And then, it did explode. Two men in suits appeared at the warehouse in the middle of the afternoon. Their expressions were serious, their well-cut suits contrasting with the industrial environment. They looked for Morris, who led them directly to Tom. "You're Tom, right?" asked one of the men, his voice firm and straightforward. "Yes," he answered, trying to stay calm. "We need you to leave," the other man said. "Now." Tom frowned. "Leave? Why? I'm just working." "You're disturbing the order," replied the first one, crossing his arms. "Your presence here is no longer acceptable." Tom's blood boiled. He had worked hard without complaining, trying to stay strong despite everything. Now they wanted to remove him without reason? He straightened his posture and faced the men. "I haven't done anything wrong. I have a job here, and I'm going to continue doing it." The men didn't like the response. One of them grabbed Tom's arm, trying to force him to move. The resistance was immediate. "Let me go!" he shouted, pushing the man backward. The impact was enough to make him stumble into a pile of boxes, knocking some of them to the floor. The other workers stopped what they were doing, watching closely, but no one intervened. Morris just observed from a distance, showing no signs of helping. When the situation seemed about to spiral out of control, the warehouse door opened. Carter entered, accompanied by his lawyer, who wore a rigid and professional expression. "What's going on here?" asked Carter, his voice resonating through the space. The suited men backed away, clearly uncomfortable with Carter's presence. One of them tried to justify himself. "Mr. Carter, we're just ensuring your operation isn't harmed." "Harmed?" Carter interrupted, looking directly at them. "By someone who's working honestly. Who gave you this authority?" The lawyer stepped forward, adjusting his glasses. "If there's one more attempt to remove any employee without just cause, we'll take the case forward." "Understood?" The two men exchanged nervous looks before muttering something inaudible and quickly leaving the warehouse. Carter looked at Tom, who was still catching his breath. He didn't seem angry, but his expression was serious. "Tom," he said, approaching, "I gave you a chance because I saw something in you, but the truth is it won't be easy. You're being watched from all sides, and you'll need to prove you deserve to be here." Tom nodded, the weight of the millionaire's words falling on him. He knew the path would be difficult, but he was willing to face it. When the shift ended, Tom left the warehouse with tired shoulders, but renewed determination. He felt there was much at stake, more than he had imagined at the beginning. Before leaving, he looked back and saw Carter standing at the door, his gaze fixed on him. "I gave you a chance," Carter said, "but now you need to live up to it, or this all falls apart." The next morning, Tom entered the warehouse trying to act as if nothing had happened. The weight of Morris and Klein's stares still hung over him, but he couldn't afford to appear shaken. The warehouse was as busy as ever, with boxes being carried, forklifts moving in zigzag, and workers' voices mixed with the sound of engines. He tried to focus on work, but the tension in the air was almost palpable. Every noise seemed amplified. Every word spoken behind him made his heart beat faster. He knew he had crossed a line by noting down the details of the invoices, and Klein hadn't taken his eyes off him since then. Mid-morning, while moving a stack of boxes to the back of the warehouse, he felt a hard bump on his shoulder. He turned and found Mark, an employee with a sour look and a smirk that didn't hide his intention to provoke. "Watch out there, boss's pet," said Mark, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "We wouldn't want you to get hurt while carrying such a heavy box." Tom clenched his teeth, breathing deeply to contain his irritation. He knew responding would only make things worse. But Mark didn't stop. "Tell me something," he continued, following Tom. "What did you do to get this position? I bet it was something special. A random bum. And now you're here acting like you're someone important." "I'm just working," Tom replied, trying to stay calm. "Like everyone else." "Like everyone else?" Mark laughed loudly, attracting other workers' attention. "You're not like everyone else. You're an imposter." Tom tried to ignore it. He kept walking but felt anger bubbling inside him. He passed by Mark with the box in his arms, but the other man took the opportunity to push him slightly, enough to make him stumble. The box fell to the ground, and Tom heard the sound of papers scattering. He bent down to gather the documents, trying to control the trembling in his hands. Other workers watched from afar, some with looks of pity, others with indifference. Mark pushed Tom again, this time harder, and he fell to his knees. "Say something, pet," Mark mocked. "Come on, show that you have courage." The tension exploded. Tom stood up quickly, anger finally overflowing. "You want to know what courage I have?" he said, facing Mark. "I have the courage to do this, to fight for this. And you? What do you have besides empty words?" Mark stepped forward, his face now red with fury. Before he could respond, he pushed Tom again, this time knocking over a stack of boxes. Papers flew everywhere, spreading across the floor like leaves in the wind. Tom tried to protect some of the falling documents. He immediately recognized some of the invoices he had observed before. They were among the papers, scattered and visible for anyone who wanted to look. He dove to collect them, but Mark didn't give up, pulling him away. The sound of the commotion echoed through the warehouse, and soon Klein appeared, with his carefully calculated expression of surprise. "What's going on here?" he asked, looking at the mess. "It was him," Mark said immediately, pointing at Tom. "He caused all this." Tom looked at Klein, holding the invoices he had managed to grab. "These documents," he began, his voice firm, despite the adrenaline, "are full of errors. There's something wrong with the accounts, and you know it." Klein raised an eyebrow, his smile now a bit tenser. "Errors, is it? Are you implying something, Tom?" "I'm not implying," said Tom, taking a deep breath. "I'm saying there's something wrong, and someone needs to explain this." The other workers remained silent, watching attentively. Klein looked around, as if measuring each face in the room. He then smiled again, but this time there was something cold and threatening in his eyes. "Tom," he said, his voice soft but heavy with weight. "If you think you found something, maybe you should be more careful. It's not wise to mess with things you don't understand." Tom felt a chill down his spine. He knew Klein was trying to intimidate him, but he couldn't back down now. He kept his gaze steady, holding the invoices as if they were a weapon. Mark, on the other hand, retreated to the back, clearly satisfied with having instigated the confusion. Klein turned his attention to him and, with a nod, made it clear that he'd had enough. The tension in the room decreased, but the sense of danger remained. As Tom collected the rest of the papers and put them back in the boxes, he realized the gravity of the situation. Klein wasn't going to simply ignore what had happened. He knew too much, and that made him a target. The other workers began to disperse, returning to work as if nothing had happened. Klein cast one last look at Tom before leaving, and the enigmatic smile on his face said everything that needed to be said. When Tom was finally alone, kneeling among the crumpled papers, he understood that he was in a trap, and it was about to close. Tom, kneeling among crumpled papers, realizes that Klein intends to frame him, and his chance at a fresh start is hanging by a thread. The warehouse was silent in the early evening, but to Tom, the environment seemed to scream with the weight of accusations. He sat in the corner of an old bench near the entrance, his hands trembling slightly as he tried to organize his thoughts. Klein had made it clear that he would be the scapegoat for something much bigger. And now it seemed that Carter was starting to believe the lies. Earlier that day, Carter had shown up in the middle of the confusion, his face serious, while Klein pointed to scattered documents and accused Tom of disorganization and, worse, of meddling where he shouldn't. Tom tried to explain, but the words seemed to fall on tired ears. "It's not what it looks like," Tom said desperately. I just wanted to help. I noticed there were mistakes." Carter raised his hand to silence him. "Tom, you're already in a delicate position. I'll analyze everything before making any decision, but for now, I suggest you avoid more confusion." That phrase echoed in Tom's mind as he stared into the emptiness of the warehouse. He knew that if he didn't do something, it would be the end. The job, the apartment, and any possibility of rebuilding his life would disappear. He felt the pressure like a physical weight on his shoulders. Outside, the sound of Marta's footsteps brought him back to reality. She was leaning against the door, arms crossed and a sarcastic smile on her face. "I told you this would happen," she taunted, her voice laden with contempt. "Did you really think they would let you rise? Look at you now." "Marta, this isn't the time for that," Tom responded, trying to stay calm. "Not the time? Then when will it be?" She laughed without humor. "Don't you see, Tom? People like us never get a real chance. And when it seems like we do, it's only because someone's going to take advantage of you." "I can prove my innocence," he said, his voice filled with determination. "I just need to find something that shows what Klein is doing." Marta shook her head, disbelieving. "And you think they'll listen to you? They don't even trust you. Why would they trust you now?" Tom didn't respond. Instead, he closed his eyes, trying to remember something, any detail that could help him. That's when he remembered the receipt. During the fight in the warehouse, he had seen a fallen piece of paper that seemed out of place, a receipt with a signature he now believed to be Klein's. If he could find it, maybe he had a chance. He stood up abruptly, grabbing his coat while Marta watched him curiously. "What are you going to do now?" she asked, her voice loaded with sarcasm. "I'm going to look for proof," he said. "If I find that receipt, I can show the truth." Marta shrugged. "Good luck with that. But I wouldn't be surprised if you end up worse than you already are." Tom ignored the provocation and went out into the cold night. He walked through the silent streets, the wind cutting his face while his mind worked frantically. He knew that returning to the warehouse at that hour would be risky, but he had no other option. Klein was building a trap, and he needed to act before it was too late. Upon reaching the warehouse, the place seemed deserted, except for a faint light coming from a side window. He found a discreet entrance, a back door that was ajar. With his heart beating fast, he entered, moving carefully to avoid making noise. The interior was immersed in shadows. The smell of paper, dust, and machine oil filled the air. He moved forward slowly, trying to remember where he had last seen the receipt. Every sound seemed amplified. The rustling of papers, the creak of wood under his feet, even his own breathing. He approached the place where the confusion had happened. Papers were still scattered on the floor, mixed with broken boxes. He began to rummage through the pile, his eyes alert for any sign of the receipt. Suddenly, he heard footsteps echoing in the nearby corridor. He froze, holding his breath as the guard's boots approached. The beam of a flashlight passed through the warehouse entrance, briefly illuminating the spot where he was hiding. Tom crouched behind a stack of boxes, holding the amulet in his pocket as if it were protection. The footsteps continued for a few seconds before moving away. He let out a relieved sigh, but knew he needed to be quick. He went back to searching through the papers, his heart racing. Finally, his fingers found something, a crumpled piece of paper, almost indistinguishable among the others. He quickly unfolded it and saw what he was looking for, the receipt, with Klein's signature and details that left no doubt that something was wrong. Tom pressed the receipt against his chest, feeling a wave of relief. He had the proof. But before he could move, he heard a sound behind him. He turned and saw Marta standing at the entrance, arms crossed. "I knew you were going to do something crazy," she said, but her voice no longer had the sarcastic tone from before. There was something different, almost a genuine curiosity. "I found it," said Tom, showing the receipt. "It's proof that Klein is embezzling money." Marta slowly approached, looking at the paper in his hands. "And now? What are you going to do?" "I'm going to take this to Carter," he replied. "He needs to know the truth." She was silent for a moment, looking at him as if seeing him differently. Finally, she sighed. "If you really believe in this, then I'll go with you. Someone needs to be there to make sure you don't get crushed along the way." Tom nodded, grateful for the offer. Together, they left the warehouse with the receipt secure in his hands. The night was cold, but Tom felt a different warmth inside. For the first time in days, he had a real chance to turn the game around. Tom mutters to himself, "If I find that receipt, I can turn the game around." He stares at the warehouse's back door, determined to enter. The warehouse was shrouded in shadows as Tom carefully opened the back door, the folded receipt secure in his pocket. Every noise seemed amplified in that dense silence, and he felt his heart pounding like a drum in his ears. Marta was right behind him, her gaze suspicious but resolute, as if she didn't want to admit she cared, but also couldn't let him face this alone. "What exactly are we looking for here?" she whispered, crossing her arms to protect herself from the cold. "More evidence, if we can find it," Tom replied. "Something that links Klein directly to what he's doing. And you think you'll find that alone? Seems like a bad idea." "Maybe," said Tom, pausing for a moment to look at her. "But it's the only chance I have." They entered, their footsteps echoing softly on the concrete floor. Tom led the way to the area where the papers had been scattered during the earlier confusion. There were still traces of chaos, overturned boxes, crumpled invoices, but what he needed was safe in his pocket. Now it was a matter of strengthening the evidence, finding something more solid to present to Carter. Suddenly a noise interrupted his thoughts. Footsteps, heavy and rhythmic, echoing closer with each second. Marta grabbed Tom's arm, pulling him behind a stack of pallets. "Security," she muttered, leaning just enough to peek down the corridor. Tom nodded, keeping still as a flashlight beam swept across the space. The guard passed slowly, not noticing anything out of place, but the tension between them only grew. Once the man moved away, Tom released the breath he hadn't even realized he was holding. "This is crazy," whispered Marta. "What if he comes back?" "Then we need to be quick," he said, returning to work. The following minutes were a blur of papers, stacks of documents turned over, and the relentless search for anything that could incriminate Klein. Then, finally, Tom found something. A series of inconsistent invoices, all linked to a non-existent client. Forged signatures, numbers that didn't add up. It was enough to reinforce the receipt in his hands. "This here," he said, showing the papers to Marta. "It's the connection we need. If Carter sees this, he can't ignore it." "And if he does ignore it?" asked Marta, still skeptical. "Then I'm finished," Tom replied simply. "But at least I'll know I tried." She stared at him for a moment, her face a mixture of exasperation and perhaps a bit of respect. "You really think you can change things, don't you?" "I don't know," he admitted. "But someone needs to try." They left the warehouse through the same back door, more cautious this time. The night cold was almost cutting, but Tom barely felt it. The adrenaline kept his body warm, his focus fixed on the next step, finding Carter before Klein could act. Walking through the streets, Marta was strangely quiet. Finally, she spoke. "Tom, if this goes wrong, what will you do?" He looked at her, surprised by the question. "I don't know, but I won't give up. I can't." She shook her head. "You're an idiot, you know that?" Tom smiled, for the first time in hours. "Probably." The city seemed emptier that night, the distant sounds of sirens and footsteps echoing through the deserted sidewalks. In the distance, Carter's building rose on the horizon, impressively lit against the night sky. It was the final destination, and Tom knew everything would depend on what happened there. They reached the building just before dawn, the sky beginning to lighten with soft shades of blue and orange. Tom paused for a moment on the sidewalk, looking at the building as if trying to absorb the gravity of the moment. Marta, beside him, took a deep breath. "Ready for this?" she asked. "No," he admitted, "but I'm going to do it anyway." They climbed the steps in silence, and Tom clutched the receipt in his pocket, feeling the crumpled paper against his palm. It was his only weapon, his only hope. When they entered, the lobby was empty except for a sleepy security guard at the reception. He looked at them curiously but said nothing as Tom and Marta waited for the elevator. When the doors finally opened, Tom felt his heart was about to explode. As they went up, he wondered how he would be received. Would Carter believe him? Or would Klein have already managed to manipulate the situation in his favor? The questions swirled in his mind, but he pushed them away. There was no more time for doubts. When the elevator doors opened, Carter's office was quiet, except for the distant sound of a wall clock. Marta placed her hand on Tom's shoulder for a brief moment, almost like a gesture of encouragement, before he stepped forward. Tom looked up at the brightening sky, saying to Marta, "Let's end this charade." She nods, and they head toward the truth. The morning sun bathed the office with a soft glow as Tom and Marta entered Carter's building. The air was tense, heavy with the expectation of what was to come. Tom held the receipt and invoices in his hand, his fingers gripping the paper as if they were a talisman. Marta followed him, her expression closed, but with a silent determination he had never seen before. As they entered Carter's room, they were greeted by an unsettling silence. Carter himself was sitting in his leather chair with a serious and cold expression. Klein was standing beside him, his face carefully neutral, although there was a calculating gleam in his eyes. Morris was leaning against a wall, avoiding Tom's gaze. "Good morning," said Carter, his voice laden with formality. "Tom, do you have anything to say before we make a decision about your situation?" Tom took a deep breath. He felt Marta move closer, almost as if giving him strength. He stepped forward, his eyes fixed on Carter's. "I have proof," he began. Proof that Klein is embezzling money from the company. He tried to frame me to cover up his own mistakes." Klein snorted, a low sound loaded with contempt. "This is absurd," he said. "This man is desperate. He's trying to save his own skin after causing chaos in the warehouse." "I didn't cause any chaos," Tom retorted, his voice firm. He placed the receipt and invoices on Carter's desk. "These documents show fraudulent transactions and signatures that don't match the real records. They prove that Klein is behind this." Carter took the papers, his eyes examining each line carefully. The room fell silent except for the sound of paper being turned. Carter's face was unreadable, but Tom noticed something had changed in his posture. Klein, however, wasn't willing to yield. "These papers could have been forged," he said with forced calmness. "There's nothing here that proves I did anything wrong. It's a beggar's word against mine." Tom felt anger boiling inside him, but before he could respond, Marta intervened. "I was there," she said, her voice cutting through the air like a blade. "I saw Tom struggling to defend these papers. He could have run away, but he didn't. He's here because he knows this is the truth." Carter raised his eyes to her, evaluating her words. He then turned his attention to Morris. "Morris," he said, "do you have anything to add?" The man hesitated, running his hand over his neck. Finally, he muttered, "I always suspected Klein, but I never had the courage to say anything. The kid might be right." Klein turned to Morris, his eyes glowing with contained anger. "You're really taking his side?" he asked, his voice loaded with venom. Carter stood up, interrupting the exchange. "Enough," he said, his voice now loaded with authority. He looked at Klein, his eyes cold. "These documents, along with the testimonies, are sufficient to start an investigation. You're fired, effective immediately, and I'll make sure the authorities are notified." Klein tried to argue, but Carter raised his hand. "I don't want to hear anything else. Get out of my office." With a pale face, Klein gathered his things and left, casting a final hateful look at Tom before disappearing through the door. The silence that followed was almost deafening. Carter turned to Tom. His face softened, and for the first time in days, there was something that looked like respect in his eyes. "You proved your honesty and determination," he said. "And more importantly, you proved that I was right to believe in you." Tom took a deep breath, feeling an immense weight being lifted from his shoulders. He looked at Marta, who gave him a slight supportive smile. Something rare, but which meant the world to him. "Tom," Carter continued, "I want you to know that this was just the beginning. I'm not going to give you $1 million, but I'll give you something better, a path to build it. From today on, you'll have a higher position, training, and a real chance to grow here." Tom was speechless for a moment. He held the medallion in his pocket, feeling its cold texture against his palm. "Thank you, Mr. Carter," he finally said, his voice full of gratitude. "I promise I won't disappoint." Marta touched his arm lightly, a small gesture but loaded with meaning. "Looks like you made it, Tom," she said, with a smile that was half playful, half proud. Carter shook Tom's hand, and at that moment, everything seemed possible. Tom knew the path would still be difficult, but for the first time, he felt he had the tools and support to face the future. As they left the building, the sun shone brighter on the horizon, and Tom felt a different warmth in his chest. He looked at Marta, and then at the sky. Tom leaves the building feeling the sun on his face, thinking, "The first $1 million isn't received, it's earned, and this time I have someone who believes in me."